Welcome back to Midnight Affair Tales. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to part 2 of A Navy SEAL's Wife Cheated with His Best Friend. Now he's hunting them both like an enemy target. Mason ran. His feet pounded against the dirt road as he sprinted into the tree line, branches clawing at his arms. His breath came in sharp, ragged gasps, his lungs burning. His heart slammed against his ribs. Behind him? Silence. Too much silence. He knew better. Luke wasn't going to charge after him like some amateur. No, Luke was a SEAL. A hunter. He didn't chase his prey. He let them run themselves into exhaustion. Mason stumbled over a root, nearly falling face first. His hands caught the ground, gravel biting into his palms. Keep moving. Keep moving. He reached into his pocket, fumbling for his phone, but it was gone. He had left it in the car. Panic crawled up his spine. No phone. No way to call for help. He was in the middle of nowhere. Alone. And Luke? Luke was out there. Watching. Waiting. A rustling sound behind him. Mason froze. His breath hitched. He turned slowly, sweat dripping down his temple. Nothing. The forest was thick with shadows. The moon barely cut through the towering trees. But the feeling, he wasn't alone. Then, a whisper. Oh, amused. Deadly. You're slowing down, Mason's pulse pounded in his ears. His eyes darted through the trees, desperate to see him. Nothing. Just shadows. But he was out there. Luke's voice came again, somewhere in the darkness. I thought Marines were supposed to be tough. But you're just a coward, aren't you? Mason clenched his fists, his teeth grinding together. Shut the F***ck up. A low chuckle. Then a gunshot. Bang. The bark of a tree exploded inches from Mason's head. He hit the ground hard, rolling behind a thick trunk, chest heaving. Another shot. This one even closer. Luke was toying with him. Pushing him. Breaking him. Mason squeezed his eyes shut. He knew how this worked. This was psychological warfare. Luke had always been colder. More calculated. Mason was good in a firefight, but Luke? Luke was built for the kill. Another rustle. Footsteps. Mason's breath came in short bursts. Move. You have to move. He turned, ready to bolt. But a boot slammed onto his chest, pinning him down. Mason gasped. Luke stood over him, gun pointed between his eyes. Come. Steady. No hesitation. This is disappointing, Luke murmured. Mason's body shook violently. He had lost. Completely. Son. Mason's blood ran cold. Luke was here. Luke crouched down, gun still aimed at Mason's forehead. His expression was unreadable. Ice cold. Calculated. Mason barely breathed. You stole from me, Luke said quietly. Not just my wife. Not just my home. His finger flexed over the trigger. You stole my peace. Mason swallowed hard. Luke, please. Bang. The bullet whizzed past his ear. Mason flinched violently, his ears ringing. Luke never missed. Which meant, that was intentional. Luke leaned in, voice barely above a whisper. I should kill you. Right here. Right now. Mason's breath hitched. This was it. This was how he died. Then, Luke exhaled sharply. But that's too easy. Mason blinked, his chest rising and falling in uneven gasps. What? Luke's mouth curled into a slow, cruel smile. Killing you would be mercy, Mason. He tilted his head. And you don't deserve mercy. Mason swallowed thickly, the weight of those words sinking into his bones. You're going to live, Luke continued, standing up. But you're going to live alone. Mason's hands shook violently. What the hell does that mean? Luke turned away, walking a few paces into the darkness. Then he pulled out his phone. Mason's stomach twisted. You took Vanessa from me, Luke said. So now? I take her from you. Mason's heart stopped. A video popped up on Luke's screen. He turned it toward Mason. Mason froze. His breath caught. The screen showed Vanessa. Bound. Gagged. Sitting in the trunk of Luke's truck. Eyes wide. Tears streaming down her face. Mason's body locked up. No, no, Luke, please. Luke's voice was calm. Unshaken. Deadly. You never deserved her. Then he pressed a button. The screen went black. The trunk had just closed. Mason's world shattered. Luke slid the phone back into his pocket. Game over, Mason. Then he walked away. And Mason? He screamed. Pause here. Dear good listeners, a lot of people listen to the story but only 5% subscribe. I work hard to bring you amazing stories every day. This time, my goal is to hit 1,000 subscribers this week. So, my awesome audience, show some love. Hit that subscribe button now. Let's continue our story. Mason sat there, his back against the dirt, his hands digging into the cold earth. His lungs burned from screaming, but no one was coming. No one could save him. His mind was spinning. Vanessa. She was in Luke's trunk. Terrified. Luke was walking away like this was just another mission. Mason forced himself to move. He pushed off the ground, stumbling forward. Luke? His voice was raw, broken. Luke didn't stop. Didn't even flinch. Mason ran, legs aching, heart hammering. Please. Nothing. Then, the roar of an engine. Luke's black truck rumbled to life. Mason's entire body locked up. No. Luke pulled onto the road slowly, deliberately. Mason sprinted. Stop. Don't do this. The brake lights flashed, just for a second. Then, in the dim glow of the taillights, Mason saw it. The silhouette of Vanessa, pounding on the inside of the trunk. Mason's heart collapsed in on itself. And then Luke drove off. Mason fell to his knees, his hands gripping his hair, his breath coming in uneven gasps. He was alone. Completely alone. Luke had taken everything. And now he had Vanessa's life in his hands. Mason forced himself to move. His mind was screaming at him, "You can't let this happen." He didn't know where Luke was taking her. Didn't know if he had minutes or hours. But one thing was clear, if he didn't find her, she was as good as dead. His hands shook as he hotwired a car from the gas station parking lot. The old habits, the ones he swore he left behind after the military, came back like second nature. The engine rumbled to life. He slammed on the gas. Where would Luke take her? He ran through the possibilities. Luke wasn't sloppy. He wouldn't leave a trail. But Mason knew him. He had to leave something. His eyes flicked to his phone. The last text from Luke. "You never deserved her." That meant something. That was a clue. Mason clenched the wheel. Where did Luke propose to Vanessa? Where did they make their best memories? Then, it hit him. The old lake house. The one Luke's father built. A secluded cabin miles from town. No neighbors. No witnesses. Mason's foot slammed the gas pedal. Because if he was right, then Vanessa was already running out of time. The drive felt endless. The roads were dark, the trees closing in on him. Mason's fingers gripped the steering wheel so tight it hurt. Every second counted. He could feel it. Luke was planning something final. When he finally reached the lake house, he killed the engine. The place was silent. The water behind the house was still, reflecting the moon. And then, a sound. A muffled cry. Mason's pulse spiked. He moved slow, controlled. His boots made no sound on the damp ground. Then footsteps. Not his. His breath hitched. He pressed himself against the cabin wall, his heart hammering. Luke was inside. Then Luke's voice. "Come. Steady." Mocking. "I knew you'd come, Mason." Mason closed his eyes, gripping his fists. Luke chuckled. "Come inside. Let's finish this." Mason exhaled slowly. Then he stepped through the door. Mason stepped into the cabin. The air was thick, stifling, heavy with the weight of what was coming. The wooden floor creaked beneath his boots. His muscles were tight, his breath controlled, but his mind? His mind was screaming. Vanessa was here. Somewhere. Luke stood in the center of the dimly lit room. A single overhead light flickered above him, casting his shadow long and distorted. He was calm. Too calm. Mason's pulse thundered in his ears. Luke tilted his head, amusement flickering in his cold blue eyes. "You actually made it." Mason's fists clenched. "Where is she?" Luke sighed, running a hand over his jaw. Straight to business. No apology? No last words. Mason's breath came out ragged. "Where the F***ck is she, Luke?" A slow smile curled at the edges of Luke's lips. Then he stepped aside. And Mason saw her. Vanessa was tied to a chair in the corner of the room. A rag was stuffed in her mouth, her wrists bound behind her back. Her mascara streaked down her face, eyes wide with sheer terror. Mason's stomach turned violently. "Vanessa." He took a step forward. Bang. A bullet slammed into the floor between his feet. Mason froze. Luke twirled the gun in his hand, shaking his head. Ah. Stay right there. Mason's fists trembled. His chest rose and fell in sharp, ragged bursts. Luke, let her go. Luke clicked his tongue. Let her go? Interesting idea. But see, Mason. His face darkened. I don't think you understand what this is. He stepped closer. The gun was still loose in his grip, but Mason knew better. Luke was in total control. This isn't about Vanessa anymore, Luke murmured. It's about you. About what you took from me. Mason's teeth gritted. Get up, okay? I was a DCK. I betrayed you. I know that. His voice cracked. But don't punish her for it. This is between us. Luke exhaled slowly. You're right. Then, he pointed the gun at Mason's chest. Mason's body went still. Luke's voice dropped to a whisper. That's why you're the one who's going to die tonight. Mason stared down the barrel of the gun. He had been in battle before. Had faced death. But this was different. Because this time, it wasn't an enemy holding the weapon. It was Luke. His best friend. The man who had once called him brother. And Mason had destroyed that bond. Luke tilted his head, studying him. His finger twitched over the trigger. You want to beg, Mason? His voice was calm. Mocking. Give me a reason not to pull this trigger. Mason swallowed hard. His hands trembled at his sides. Get up. I know that. I deserve this, man. His voice cracked. But please don't kill me. Luke let out a soft laugh. You don't get to beg now. You didn't beg when you were screwing my wife, did you? Mason's chest ached. Luke, I swear. I regret it. Luke's face hardened. His knuckles went white around the gun. Do you? Do you really? His voice was sharp, dangerously close to breaking. Mason nodded, his breath shaky. I was weak. I was a piece of SHT. I should have walked away. I should have never touched her. His voice trembled. I lost everything, Luke. I lost my job. My life. My f***ing soul. Luke exhaled sharply. His expression flickered for a split second, like he was battling something inside. Then his jaw locked. Not enough. The gun pressed harder against Mason's chest. Mason's breath hitched. He squeezed his eyes shut. This was it. Then, a soft whimper. Mason's eyes snapped open. Vanessa. Her tear-streaked face twisted in agony. She shook her head frantically, muffled cries breaking through the gag. She was begging. Not for herself. For him. Something in Luke's face shifted. His grip faltered for the first time. His eyes flickered to Vanessa. Then back to Mason. A muscle in his jaw twitched. Then he stepped back. Mason let out a sharp breath, his body sagging with relief. Luke's expression darkened. I won't kill you, Mason. Mason blinked. Wait, what? Luke tilted his head. His lips curled into something far worse than a smirk. A satisfied smile. You don't deserve death, he murmured. Mason's stomach dropped. Because he realized something terrifying. Luke wasn't going to end his suffering. He was going to extend it. Luke turned to Vanessa. His voice was eerily soft. Untie her. Mason hesitated. What? Luke's gaze snapped back to him, sharp and commanding. You heard me. Mason swallowed hard. His hands shook as he reached for Vanessa's ropes, untying them with clumsy fingers. She fell forward, sobbing. Her body shook violently. Luke watched them with cold amusement. Then he pulled out a folder. Mason's pulse spiked. Luke flipped it open and dropped it onto the floor between them. The paper spilled out. Bank statements. Private messages. Cheating receipts. Evidence. Mason stared, confusion twisting his gut. What is this? Luke exhaled, crouching down beside the mess. It's everything. He flicked a paper toward Vanessa. Proof of your affair. Another paper. Proof that Mason got fired for fraud. Another. Proof that Vanessa's bank account is gone. Every last dollar. Vanessa gasped. No, you didn't. Luke cut her off. His blue eyes were ice. You two deserve each other. His voice was calm, collected. But inside that voice was pure rage. Mason felt something deep in his gut. Something worse than fear. Luke had just destroyed them. Not with a bullet. With truth. With cold, calculated destruction. Luke straightened, pocketing his gun. He let out a slow breath like he had finally won. Mason stared at him, his chest hollow. What now? His voice cracked. Luke smirked. You live, Mason. Then he walked out. And Mason? Mason collapsed. Because in that moment he realized death would have been mercy. Mason sat on the cabin floor, his body trembling. His mind felt hollow, like someone had scooped out everything inside him and left nothing but regret. Luke was gone. Vanessa was still here. She sobbed quietly beside him, her wrists raw from the ropes, her mascara smeared down her cheeks. She looked at him, but not with love. Not with fear. With disgust. This is your fault, she whispered. Mason's breath hitched. Vanessa. She pushed him away, her voice rising. You should have stopped this. You should have. She broke off into another sob, her whole body shaking. Mason felt something snap inside him. Stop this? Vanessa, are you King serious? His voice cracked. You think I could have stopped him? She stared at him, her lips quivering. Mason let out a bitter laugh. Do you even know who Luke is? What he's capable of? We thought we were just having an affair, just sneaking around behind his back, but we weren't cheating on a normal man. His voice darkened. We were cheating on King predator. Vanessa flinched, her body stiffening. Mason ran a shaking hand through his hair, his breath uneven. He didn't just take our money. He didn't just take our reputations. He exhaled sharply, looking her in the eyes. He took our lives. Vanessa swallowed hard, her breathing shallow. What do we do now? Mason's chest tightened. There was nothing to do. Luke had left them alive, but he had left them with nothing. And that was worse. They left the cabin at dawn, walking in silence. Mason's car was still there, but the tires were slashed. The engine wires had been cut. Luke had planned for everything. Vanessa hugged her arms, shivering despite the warm air. Where do we go? Mason stared at the horizon. He had no answer. Luke had burned every bridge they had. Their money? Gone. Their reputations? Destroyed. Their futures? Non-existent. They didn't even have their shame anymore. Luke had dragged their affair into the open, exposed them like cockroaches under a floodlight. Mason clenched his fists. He's not done, he muttered. Vanessa turned to him, her blue eyes dull. What? Mason licked his dry lips, his pulse pounding in his ears. Look. He left us breathing, but he's not done. He's never done. Vanessa paled. Mason felt it too. Luke wasn't finished. He had one last move left. And Mason didn't know when or how, but it was coming. That night, Mason got one last text. It was short. Simple. Unknown number, check the news. His fingers trembled as he opened the browser. His breath caught in his throat. Right there on the front page. A mugshot of Vanessa. A headline screaming. Breaking, Vanessa Caldwell under investigation for fraud and tax evasion. Anonymous source provides evidence to federal authorities. Mason's world tilted. Vanessa gasped beside him, her hands flying to her mouth. No, this isn't real. But it was. Luke's final move. Mason had lost his career. His money. His reputation. And now, Vanessa was going to prison. Mason turned away from her, his stomach twisting. Because for the first time since this nightmare started, he didn't feel bad for her. Vanessa hyperventilated as she reread the headline, her hands trembling so violently that the phone slipped from her grasp and clattered onto the cheap motel floor. This can't be real, she choked out, her voice barely above a whisper. Mason, this has to be fake. Some kind of mistake. Mason didn't respond. He just stared at the screen, his pulse roaring in his ears. His eyes moved over the details, IRS investigations, court hearings, a deep dive audit into all of Vanessa's past financial dealings. Luke had set her up so perfectly that the system was now swallowing her whole. Vanessa grabbed his wrist, her nails digging into his skin. Mason, we have to do something. Mason laughed. A cold, bitter sound that had nothing to do with humor. Vanessa flinched. What the F***ck is funny about this? Mason exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You don't get it, do you? His voice was eerily calm. There is nothing to do. Nothing we can do. Vanessa's chest rose and fell in quick, sharp bursts. We can fight this. We can. No, Mason turned to her, his eyes dark. Hollow. Dead inside. We can't. Vanessa's mouth snapped shut. Mason let out a slow breath, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. This isn't just an anonymous tip, Vanessa. This isn't some hacker pulling a prank. He held up the phone, shaking it for emphasis. This is Luke. Vanessa paled. Mason's voice dropped lower, like a warning, like a eulogy. He doesn't make mistakes. Mason sat on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing. His mind felt like a static-filled radio, distorted, broken, unsalvageable. Across the room, Vanessa frantically paced, her hands tugging at her hair. We can disappear, she muttered. We can cross the border. Without money? Mason snapped. Without passports? Without *King plan. Vanessa froze. Her lips parted. Mason exhaled sharply, rubbing his face with both hands. You're not getting it. His voice was eerily calm. Luke didn't just ruin us. He turned, his eyes locking onto hers. He erased us. Vanessa shook her head, her breath catching in her throat. We can fix this. How? Mason's voice snapped like a whip. Vanessa flinched. Mason ran a shaking hand through his hair, his breathing uneven. You don't fix this. There's no fixing this. His voice wavered. You don't escape someone like him. Silence settled between them. Vanessa swallowed hard. So what? We just sit here and wait for him to kill us. Mason let out a breathless laugh. Kill us? He turned to her, his eyes dead inside. Vanessa, he doesn't need to kill us. She paled. Mason leaned back, exhaling slowly. He already has. Days passed. Neither Mason nor Vanessa slept. They barely ate. The motel room became a prison, a tomb where time stretched endlessly. Mason stopped counting the hours. He no longer checked the news. Vanessa barely spoke. When she did, it was hollow. Empty. The weight of their destruction hung in the air like a noose. And then one night, it happened. A knock. Slow. Deliberate. Mason's heart slammed into his throat. Vanessa shot up from the bed, her eyes wide. The knock came again. 3 taps. No rush. No urgency. Mason's breath turned shallow. His fingers curled into fists. He knew. King knew. Vanessa's hand gripped his arm so tightly her nails dug into his skin. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Mason, what do we do? Mason didn't answer. Because for the first time in his entire life he didn't know. The knock came again. And this time? The door handle turned. The door handle turned. Vanessa stifled a scream, her whole body trembling as she clung to Mason's arm. Mason's breathing turned shallow. His fingers twitched toward the broken lamp on the nightstand, the only weapon in reach. The door creaked open. A gust of cold air swept through the room. And standing there, bathed in the dim glow of the motel hallway light, was Luke. Dressed in all black. Calm. Silent. Unstoppable. His blue eyes flicked between them, his mouth tilting into a slow, knowing smirk. Mason's grip on the lamp tightened. His knuckles turned white. Luke? Luke raised a finger to his lips. A slow, taunting motion. Shoo. Mason froze. The room felt suffocating. The walls seemed to close in. Vanessa's breath hitched, her body pressing against the nightstand, her hands trembling violently. Luke tilted his head. Not sleeping well? His voice was smooth. Amused. Mason's jaw clenched. Get the *CK out. Luke exhaled, stepping further inside. Closing the door behind him. No. A single word. Final. Absolute. Mason's stomach twisted. Luke wasn't here to kill them. He was here for something worse. Luke leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching them. Mason felt his pulse hammering in his throat, but he kept his face blank. Don't give him satisfaction. Don't show fear. Vanessa, on the other hand, was shaking. Luke sighed, shaking his head. You two look like hell. No one spoke. Luke let the silence stretch like he was savoring the moment. Then, he turned his attention to Vanessa. You look different. Vanessa swallowed hard. She didn't dare move. Luke tilted his head. Not quite the same woman I married, huh? His tone was light, but his eyes? Deadly. Mason couldn't take it anymore. You got what you wanted, he growled. His voice dripped with exhaustion, defeat. You destroyed us. You took everything. Luke exhaled, rubbing his jaw. Did I? Mason's fists clenched. What more could he take? You know, Luke continued, his voice casual, too casual, I had a lot of time to think about this. What revenge should really feel like. He met Mason's gaze. I expected it to feel satisfying. Mason's breath hitched. Luke's eyes darkened. It doesn't. Vanessa let out a soft whimper, barely audible. Luke inhaled sharply, looking down at his hands, flexing his fingers. No matter how much I took from you, his gaze flickered back up, burning with something dangerous. It still isn't enough. Mason's body went rigid. OF*CK. Luke wasn't done. Not even close. Luke sighed, rolling his shoulders like he was shaking off a bad thought. Then he took a slow step forward. Mason immediately shifted in front of Vanessa, shielding her. Enough, Luke. Luke stopped. He arched an eyebrow. Enough. He let out a soft chuckle. You think you get to decide when this ends? Mason's chest tightened. Luke took another step, his presence commanding, suffocating. You took my wife, he said softly. You took my family. My peace. You made a joke out of my life. His voice hardened. You left me with nothing. Mason breathed heavily. And now you've done the same to me. Luke tilted his head. Have I? Mason blinked. What the F*** are you talking about? Luke exhaled. You're still breathing. Mason's stomach dropped. Luke smiled. A cold, hollow smile. That's the problem. Then he reached behind his back. Mason lunged. But too late. Luke pulled out the gun. And fired. The gunshot roared through the motel room. Vanessa screamed. Mason staggered back, his ears ringing, his breath choking in his throat. For a moment, everything felt frozen. He braced for pain. For death. But then, he realized. The bullet wasn't for him. Vanessa collapsed to the floor, gasping. Blood spread across her shoulder, staining her shirt a deep crimson. Mason's mind snapped. No, Vanessa. He dropped beside her, pressing his hands against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. Her panicked, tear-filled eyes locked onto his. Luke stood over them, his expression unchanged. Unmoved. I missed on purpose, he said calmly. If I wanted her dead, she'd be dead. Mason's body shook with rage. His eyes burned with something animalistic. King bastard, he roared, lunging at Luke. But Luke was faster. He sidestepped Mason effortlessly, slamming an elbow into the side of his head. Mason crashed against the nightstand, gasping for breath. His vision blurred. Luke knelt beside Vanessa, watching her writhe in pain. You'll live, he murmured. But you'll never forget this moment. Vanessa sobbed. Mason struggled to his feet. Let her go, he panted. His voice was raw. Desperate. Luke turned his cold gaze back to Mason. I already have. Luke stood up, tucking his gun away. The fight was over. Mason panted, his vision swimming, his head pounding. What the F*** do you mean? Luke exhaled, shaking his head. You still don't get it, do you? Mason gritted his teeth. Luke's voice darkened. I don't need to kill you, Mason. He took a step closer. I already did. Mason's chest tightened. Luke tilted his head. Look at yourself. Look at her. Mason's jaw clenched. He looked down at Vanessa, barely conscious, bleeding out on the floor. His hands trembled. Everything around him felt wrong. Like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Luke stepped closer. You'll spend every second of your life looking over your shoulder. Wondering if I'm still watching. Wondering if I'll come back. Mason swallowed hard. Luke's voice dropped to a whisper. You'll never be free. Mason's chest heaved. His fingers curled into fists. Luke's lips curled into a slow, knowing smirk. And that, my old friend, is a fate worse than death. Mason sat in silence. The motel room was a wreck. Vanessa had passed out, her breathing shallow, but she was alive. Gone. Vanished. The only proof he had even been there was the bullet hole in the wall and the blood on the floor. Mason's body trembled. His mind felt hollow. He had lost. Completely. There was no coming back from this. He reached for Vanessa's cold hand, gripping it weakly. His voice cracked. I'm sorry. Her eyes fluttered open. And for the first time, she didn't look at him with love. Or even hatred. She looked at him like he was nothing. Because he was. The motel room smelled like blood. Mason sat on the floor, his back against the bed, staring at the ceiling. Empty. Hollow. Finished. Vanessa was unconscious, her breathing shallow, her body weak from blood loss. But Mason? Mason was dead inside. Everything was gone. His job. His money. His reputation. His dignity. And now, even Vanessa. Because the way she had looked at him before passing out? Like he wasn't a man. Like he was nothing. Luke had won. Completely. The next morning Mason barely moved. He couldn't bring himself to call for help. Couldn't think. Couldn't breathe. Then his phone buzzed. His heart stopped. Unknown number. Check the news. Mason's blood turned cold. His shaking fingers opened the news app. And right there, on the front page, a new headline. Vanessa Caldwell arrested at motel for fraud investigation. Police respond to anonymous tip. Mason's stomach dropped. The article described how authorities had tracked Vanessa's fraudulent accounts. How she was now facing serious prison time. Mason's breath came out in sharp bursts. This was Luke. His final move. Mason grabbed Vanessa's shoulder, shaking her awake. Vanessa, wake up. She groaned, her eyelids fluttering. She was pale, weak. But before she could even register what was happening, the motel door burst open. FBI agents swarmed inside. Hands where we can see them. Vanessa screamed. Mason barely had time to react before they grabbed her, cuffing her wrists. She thrashed. No, no. Mason, help me. Mason couldn't move. He could only watch as they dragged her away. Her sobs echoed down the hall. And then she was gone. Mason sat there frozen. His entire body felt like it was sinking. This was it. This was the moment Luke had been waiting for. Not just to ruin Mason, but to make him watch as the last piece of his world crumbled. And now Mason was truly alone. 1 month later, Mason had nothing. His bank accounts were empty. His face was on every news channel. His name was garbage. Vanessa was behind bars. His old military friends? They refused to talk to him. Every night, Mason woke up in cold sweats, expecting Luke's voice in the dark. But Luke never came back. He didn't have to. Because Mason wasn't a man anymore. He was a ghost. A shell of who he used to be. A walking corpse. And that was the worst punishment of all. The last encounter. Mason sat in a cheap diner, sipping black coffee. His hands were unsteady. His clothes were wrinkled. He looked like a man who had been erased. The waitress barely glanced at him as she refilled his cup. He didn't exist anymore. Then the bell above the door jingled. Mason's body tensed. His fingers curled around the coffee cup, his breath slowing. A man slid into the seat across from him. Calm. Quiet. In control. Mason looked up. His blood ran cold. Dressed in a clean black jacket. Looking untouched. Unbothered. Like he had never lost anything at all. Mason swallowed hard. Why are you here? His voice was barely above a whisper. Luke smirked. Then he leaned forward. His voice was smooth. Steady. Deadly. I just wanted to see how my masterpiece turned out. Mason's chest tightened. Luke studied him for a moment. Then he stood up, tossing a few bills onto the table. One last thing, Mason, he said as he turned to leave. Mason barely breathed. Luke's voice dropped to a whisper. You were never worth killing. Then he walked out. Mason sat there, frozen. His hands shook. His throat burned. And for the first time in his entire life, he truly wished Luke had pulled the trigger. Before you go, this wasn't just a story. This was a lesson. Betrayal comes with a cost. And sometimes, the worst revenge isn't death. It's losing everything, and still being forced to wake up every day. Mason and Vanessa thought they could play with fire. But in the end, the fire consumed them. Now it's your turn. What do you think? Was Luke's revenge justified, or did he go too far? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you love stories filled with suspense, revenge, and shocking twists, make sure to subscribe. More thrilling stories are coming soon. Hit the following button. Because sometimes, the best stories are the ones that leave you speechless.